Peace be with you. Welcome to the Institute of All Intelligent Life. My name is Alan Kiesler, and today is Friday, the 28th of October, 2016, Juma Mubarak. And we are continuing our discussion about the history of our planet, and we're going to talk a little about the solar system also. In the context, of course, of understanding the densities, because this is such an important part of understanding our history in the larger context, the history of our planet and of other planets, dealing with the transformations from first, second, third, fourth density, etc. So we're going to wait just a minute as more people join the class. I'm just going to take a second myself also, invite you to join, to just take a deep breath and meditate for a moment. Okay, so we discussed yesterday the 75,000 year cycle, consisting of three of the cycles which are associated with the precession of the equinoxes, and how there is an ascension or an opportunity for going upward from third to fourth, or deeper if you want to use that word, denser, from third to fourth density at each of these 25,000 year completions of a cycle. But in our case, the case of our planet, it was quite unusual that in the first 25,000 year cycle completion, no earthlings were ready for harvest, and at the second, only a small number were, very small number. I think it was about 150, and they all decided to remain on the planet to help the others to become ready by the end of the third cycle, which is right now. These years that we're living in right now is the completion of the third cycle. So generally, it's expected that in each of these completions of a cycle, a certain number, a good number, of the entities on the planet will be ready for ascending, and at the end of the first cycle, a good number, and the end of the second cycle, a very large number, and by the end of the third cycle, everybody would be ready for ascending to the fourth density on a third density planet. So just a little bit of review about the densities in terms of history. As I'd mentioned before, the first density, the period of the first density on our planet was about 2 billion years. That is a little difficult to actually calculate, as it's explained in the Law of One, because time really begins after, with the second density. The concept of time depends upon the awareness of time. So, but that's the way it's calculated. And then really the history of the planet begins with the beginning of the second density, which lasted then about 4.6 billion years. Billion, not million. So 2 billion and 4.6 billion. And then the third density period is very, very quick, very short in comparison, only 75,000 years. So in the case of our planet, as I mentioned, our planet's history was very unusual compared to the usual way a planet develops. A third density planet usually just develops naturally because the second density beings on the planet at the end of the cycle of second density, the long, long, long cycle, they attain third density. And the third density beings, or human beings we would call them, they then are the natives of that planet, and they continue on in their third density cycle, experiencing the choice to choose between negative polarity and positive polarity, and making progress, and at the end of that cycle they progress into the fourth density. Now, the main reason why our planet is so unusual is that in our third density cycle, many entities joined our planet who were not from our planet. That is, about 1/4 only of the third density beings who came to our planet in the beginning of our cycle, only 1/4 were from our planet. That is, only about 1/4 were second density entities who had graduated or who had ascended into the third density. And the other 3/4 we're going to talk a little bit about today, because a large number, about half of them, were actually from Mars, the red planet. Our next planet in our solar system had a problem. That is, they had a major catastrophe, a war, you might say, and their planetary atmosphere was made uninhabitable. There is evidence, it's also available, even NASA has mentioned some of this evidence, that Mars formerly was much more habitable than it is now. The atmosphere was more, there was a lot more water on the surface of the planet. NASA has even announced that maybe half the surface of Mars was covered by a vast ocean long time ago. So this evidence, this information is also available from the modern space program, even, what to speak of the secret space program. The space program information also confirms that Mars was inhabited a long time ago, and there was some sort of catastrophe that happened that depleted the atmosphere and made it uninhabitable, or much more difficult to inhabit anyway. So this is what the Law of One books also describe, that at that time, previous to that time I should say, 75,000 years ago, the inhabitants of Mars had experienced a catastrophic war which made their planet uninhabitable. So the third density beings from Mars were transferred to this planet at the beginning of our third density cycle. So about half the beings on Earth, half the third density beings on Earth, at the beginning of our cycle of 75,000 years, that is 75,000 years ago, since this cycle is just completing now, they were from Mars, and about 1/4 were from our planet, and the other 1/4 were from many other different planets, not only in our solar system, but from other areas also. So that's because, just like what had happened on Mars, for one reason or another, beings may have to leave their planet, and they have to look for some other place. Some other place has to be found for them to continue their development. So one other planet I will talk about, very important for us to understand this also in the history of our solar system, and that is the planet that no longer exists as a planet, but now is the asteroid belt. But it once was a planet, a large planet, between Mars and Jupiter, and the name that's usually given to that, different names are given to it, but Maldek is one name. So that planet also, we're talking about a long time ago, as I recall, 705,000 years ago, Earth years ago, is about the time when this happened. There was also a catastrophic war on that planet, but it was a much worse war because the beings there had much more powerful weapons, and they actually completely destroyed their planet, and it shattered into many pieces. There are different explanations that have been given about how that happened, how the asteroid belt was formed. For example, some people have talked about a planetary collision. So there are different timelines, or there are different versions of what happened to that planet. But in any case, it was destroyed, and we have the evidence clearly before us now in terms of the asteroid belt. All the planets, as you probably know if you've done any study of astronomy at all, the Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, they're all spaced, each one is spaced close to twice as far as the previous space. In other words, the space between Mars and Venus is about doubled when you go the space between Venus and Earth, somewhat less. And the space between Venus and Earth, if you double that, or somewhat less, close to doubling it, you get the space between Earth and Mars. The space between Mars and Jupiter is much, much greater than you would expect. The space between Mars and the asteroid belt is about twice, somewhat less than twice the space between Mars and Earth. And then the space between the asteroid belt and Jupiter is somewhat less, but about twice the space between Mars and the asteroid belt. And then the space between Jupiter and Saturn going on is about twice that, somewhat less than the space between the asteroid belt and Jupiter. So just by this argument we can confirm also that we would expect there would have been a planet there between Mars and Jupiter, and that was the case, which is now the asteroid belt. So that planet was named Maldek, and the catastrophe there was much more severe than what happened on Mars. And the entities on the planet were put into a very serious condition. You can say their consciousness was very, very disturbed. You can imagine that if not only your home were destroyed, if there were a fire and your home is destroyed, you would be quite disturbed by that. But if your entire city or your entire country or your entire planet was totally shattered, that would be a very, very shocking experience, not only for the body, of course, but for the awareness, for the consciousness of the entities on that planet. So that is what happened to the entities on Maldek, that they were put into a sort of comatose state, not in terms of the body goes into a coma, but the consciousness also can be shocked into a sort of comatose state. So that's what happened to all those entities living on Maldek. And it took a long, long time before they were able to understand what had happened to them and were able to start reassembling their awareness of what was going on. I'll just give a short background here because this may seem a little confusing to some people. But when I was studying and attending the Monroe Institute, I explained in some of my earlier classes that I had met with Robert Monroe. I was at the Monroe Institute, and Robert Monroe was an American scientist, really, an engineer, and he had started spontaneously experiencing traveling out of his body, and he at first thought he was going crazy. He couldn't understand it, but finally he understood that this was not something crazy, this was just what happens, that you can actually leave your body, because in America people were not taught this way, that this was something possible. We're talking about the 1950s when this started happening to him as a young man. So he then began studying and understanding and developed techniques where he could at will leave his body, and he then developed an entire program to help other people also learn how to travel outside of your body. That is, how to separate the consciousness from the body. So one of the very interesting things that the Monroe Institute began doing when a number of people developed this ability, they started understanding that some people, when they die, if they especially have a traumatic death, they go into a sort of confused state of consciousness, and they cannot progress to keep on evolving, because they go into a state of shock. So they do not go on to another lifetime. And in that state, they can be helped. And so the Monroe Institute developed this program of people leaving their bodies and going and seeking out persons, or finding them sometimes, in that sort of comatose state or confused state of consciousness, and would actually help them to understand what had happened to them, so then they could go on with their natural evolution of consciousness. So this happens on an individual level, or on a level, say if a ship is sunk in a storm, it might happen to a group of people, but this happened to the entire planet of Maldek, that all of the inhabitants of that planet were shocked so severely that for a long time, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years, for a long, long time, they were unable to gather their awareness sufficiently to be able to continue their progress. But finally, after a long, long period of time, they also were some of the people who joined on this planet. So this is another reason why our planet's history is full of war, because some of the entities who came here, a large number, half almost, were from Mars, who had experienced war, and another group were from Maldek, who also had experienced war. So the mentality of the people on our planet, as we've seen through our history, our recorded history of Western educational, over the last few thousand years, it's been full of war. So this now is changing, inshallah. The situation on our planet is going to change, and the warring mentality of the people, the leaders especially, is going to be replaced by an attitude of harmony and cooperation, love and peace. But in terms of the history of our planet, we've seen a lot of wars, and part of the reason I've just explained, that the inhabitants of Mars and a small number of the inhabitants of Maldek ended up here on this planet at the beginning of our third density cycle 75,000 years ago. So that was just a little bit of the history of our solar system. Let me just mention one more aspect of this. Of course, there are other planets in our solar system, and many of them are not, for various reasons, not very appropriate, even for the beginning of first density conscious experience. But the ones that are have an interesting history, and I have not heard anything about about Mercury, but Venus is a very interesting planet in our solar system. It was actually one of the first, a long, long time ago. It began its first density existence, and just as our planet passed through over a long, long period of time, first and second density existence, Venus also passed through first and second density, and third and fourth, fifth and sixth density much more quickly than we did, began earlier and progressed or evolved much more quickly. And the reason was basically that the entities there were very harmonious, so they were able to evolve quickly, and they evolved to sixth density quite some time ago. Quite some time ago means many tens, hundreds of thousands of years ago. I don't know the exact date, but we do know that a group of sixth density beings from Venus have been very much involved in our history. That is, they have come to our planet in different ways, and they have assisted very, very sincerely. Sixth density beings are generally very positively oriented and very sincere in their efforts, and we are going to study more about that group of sixth density beings from Venus and how they were able to come to this planet, make themselves visible even, or communicate to us in different ways to give us some help. So that is the position of Venus in our solar system. And Mars, I have described briefly that it had progressed to third density before we had on this planet, but they had an unfortunate result of their third density experience was that although they didn't destroy their planet, they severely damaged their atmosphere, so their planet became uninhabitable for third density beings at that time. And I've talked about Maldek. The most interesting planet, I think, perhaps very, very interesting to me because I don't understand very much about it, but Saturn is a unique planet in our solar system, and I will talk about that more in the future, but it is very advanced. The civilization or the spiritual status of the beings on Saturn is very special. And the next planet, Uranus, also is progressing in its first density stage now. So let me just check the time. So we can go on a little longer, or I can look at, I see there are some good questions here. So I'm going to, yes, no topic mentioned. The topic today, as it's become obvious now, I didn't have time to insert it before beginning. We are continuing to discuss the history, especially of our solar system, a little bit more about our solar system, and then we're going to be going back to the history of our planet, going into more detail. So we're basically talking now about the densities and the history of our solar system. So let me see if there are any other questions here. Mohammed Awais, अच्छा हालात खराब हो गए पाकिस्तान में. Yes, the situation in Pakistan has become bad, he says. Well, it goes up and down, but don't worry. The near future, the not very distant future, not only Pakistan but the whole world will become transformed for the better, for the much, much better. Let me see. I thought I saw some comment. Yes, from is it Gemma Art or Gemma Art? Sometimes I feel that creative souls, people, artists, poets, innovators, etc., are in some way connected to energies from other planets or dimensions. Yes, that's a very insightful comment. This is correct. That many times poets, musicians, they themselves often feel that their inspiration is coming from some higher beings. In fact, in Greece, in ancient Greece, what we call ancient, just a few thousand years ago, there was a flourishing of creativity in Greece, and there were many poets and musicians and philosophers, and they ascribed their creativity to the muse, is the word that we use in English. Some sort of inspiration coming from outside of themselves. And often, in fact, it is due to persons from other dimensions or other planets who are helping or inspiring them, and scientists also. In fact, Nikola Tesla, who was probably the greatest scientist of the last 100 years, he was the inventor of alternating current electricity, and he developed many, many incredible scientific developments which were suppressed. For example, the creation of free energy, which can be obtained as he had demonstrated. Our planet has energy within it from which electricity can be obtained and can be transmitted wirelessly anywhere all over the world. So our energy companies of today don't want that knowledge known because their electric cables, their electric lines would be useless, and they wouldn't be able to control the electricity, they wouldn't be able to charge money for it, so they have suppressed that knowledge. But Nikola Tesla was a great scientist, a creative genius, and he himself was well aware that extraterrestrial intelligence was inspiring him and guiding him and giving him this information. So, yes, that is a very, very good point you've made. Very, very true. We are always being aided by higher beings. That is, means any person who is intelligent, creative, who has a desire especially to serve others, to serve the planet, or to serve all of existence. those persons are helped by higher intelligences. So, we have another good question here from Chuck Rays. Do you believe in the 12th planet? So this is a big, big question. We can discuss this in a whole separate class. In the future we can talk about this, but I will just briefly answer that. My understanding is, I may be wrong, but my understanding is that this information about the 12th planet, which has become quite popular in some circles in the United States and I think elsewhere by the internet, a lot of people all around the world have heard about this. So there are two things I want to say about the 12th planet. As far as I can understand, I have mentioned the companion star of the Sun, that is an infrared light emitting planet, or not planet but star, which circles our Sun, or which our Sun and it circle each other. Many, many stars, in fact most stars, appear to be double stars. It's the usual situation in our galaxy. Sometimes there are more than two. There may be 3 stars that are all circling each other. So it's not at all unusual. So in our case, although our scientists, again, the Cabal has suppressed this for their own reasons, we also, our star system is not a single star system, it's a double star system, and our companion star is an infrared red dwarf, it's what it's sometimes called, because it's a very small, compact star with a lot of density, and it's not visible to us, to our naked eyes. So that star has sometimes been called the 12th planet, and especially Zecharia Sitchin was famous. He even wrote a book called The 12th Planet, and he gave the opinion that this 12th planet comes into our solar system from time to time, and it may have been responsible. I think his theory is that it came into our planet, into our solar system at some time, and that was the cause of Maldek, or that planet between Mars and Jupiter, to be shattered into the asteroid belt. And his information was based on Sumerian texts, which he was able to translate or interpret. He did a lot of interpretation besides translation, which was different from the interpretation of most of the other scholars of the Sumerian language. But anyway, his book, The 12th Planet, talks about what he calls Nibiru, and that it also appears that that 12th planet has moons, major moons. That's the way he talks about it. But my understanding is that that planet actually is our companion star, and it has its own planets. So I don't think that, if you want to call it Nibiru, I don't think that that 12th planet or our companion star actually enters into our solar system. But it is possible that some of its planets, when the Sun and that companion star come closer together, it may be possible that some of the planets of that star and some of the planets of our star come very close together. They may overlap. So that's my understanding about the 12th planet. And the second thing I wanted to say about it is that it appears to me, and I think I'm right in this, although I may be wrong, but it appears to me that Zecharia Sitchin, knowingly or unknowingly, was part of a secret disinformation program to try to scare people that this 12th planet is going to come near Earth and is going to cause major catastrophes here, and that was going to happen in 2012. And this was part of the Cabal's plan to frighten the inhabitants of Earth to such an extent, either by an asteroid coming, or some other catastrophe, a big flood, or a big earthquake, or worldwide earthquakes, or an extraterrestrial invasion was one of their plans also, to create a fake extraterrestrial invasion. So their plan was, or one of their plans was, to say that this 12th planet is coming and is going to practically destroy the Earth, so you'd better accept our one world government to protect you. So Zecharia Sitchin, although he was a very great man and a very great scholar and an incredible writer, and he had some sort of help, obviously, from extraterrestrial influences that he was able to do what he did. He wrote many books, but I believe that the idea of the 12th planet, which he promoted, Nibiru, coming close to our planet and creating a major catastrophe, and the date that many people gave about it, although I don't know if Sakurai Sitchin gave such a date, but the date that was popularized was that it was going to happen by 2012. So this was the Cabal's plan to somehow or the other create a major catastrophe and frighten people so that by 2012 they would be able to impose their one world government fascist dictatorship on the whole planet. But of course that plan has failed. Praise God. And so that's my understanding about the 12th planet. Okay, so checking the time again. So it's 7 o'clock. We've had our half-hour class. So I'm not going to speak anything more today, but I will be happy to answer any more questions. So I'll give another minute or two to see if anybody has any more questions, and then I'll do my best to try to answer them. Otherwise, we can end the class now, no problem. And we will go on tomorrow, and we will talk more about the history, a little more on the history of our planet, and we'll talk about those sixth density beings from Venus and their interactions with our planet, because they've been very influential in the history of our planet. So we will do that tomorrow. Thank you all very much for watching and attending this class and asking a couple of good questions. And I'm just going to do one more check to see. Okay, we do have another. Sir, what about prophets? Were they sent to Mars? That's a very good question, Farhan Ahmed. I really don't know the answer to that question. I really don't know exactly what sort of prophets may have been sent to Mars. It's possible, but I really don't know. I'm sorry, I can't really answer that question. Maybe I'll be able to do some research and find out, but so far I've not heard anything about what sort of prophets may have been sent to Mars. But it's a very good question. I really appreciate that question, and it will inspire me to do some research. In fact, it means finding out a lot more about the nature of prophecy, the nature of prophets, to be able to explore and investigate that question, not only to Mars, but to other planets. And I will look into that. Thank you very, very much for that question, and I'll try to find out the answer to that. Okay, may God protect us all.